All right. Well, welcome everyone to SEJ's webinar on stopping climate action misinformation. Today, we're asking how is or even is the media complicit and what can journalists do? I'm Halle Parker, an environment reporter for New Orleans Public Radio and also the vice president of programs for the SEJ board. And I'm so happy to welcome you all here and share what will be a precursor to the conversations that will take place at this year's SEJ conference, which is all about disinformation in an election year, which you can actually still register for up through Monday. So think about it. Today, we're having an open conversation between journalists and advocates about concerns over our media outlets spreading misinformation and how both sides can work together to ensure the public is getting the facts. Today, we have our outstanding SEJ conference co-chairs as moderators, founder and publisher of Delaware Currents, Meg McGuire, and Lauren Yates, a superb freelance journalist based in Adirondack, New York, who has also worked with the Delaware Currents. And I wanted to ask Meg, do you want to talk a little bit about how this panel came to be? I know it's special.
Look, I remembered to unmute. Terrific. We're off to a
Well
good
done.
start. I first actually was in a webinar, listened to a webinar where the three panelists talked about the issues of concern, much of which they're going to be raising today. And back in November, when Jay was starting to get ideas for panels sort of collected, we started the conversation with these three panelists to sort of see where they would best fit. And honestly, one of the things that happened along the way was that the panelists themselves were not sure they wanted to be relegated to a panel. I think they would like, even now, would probably have preferred to be in a plenary session. You don't need the EPA administrator. Just let us talk. And I can understand that because the things that they have to say, and certainly the subjects that they're covering, is of crucial importance to our shared communities. So it took us a while to figure out the best way forward for them to be able to get the biggest audience. And the webinar date, this webinar date was free. And I think it was Annie Ropiak from the board who suggested, what about a webinar? Because as we can see, we now have 81 participants, which is a fair sample of SEJ folks. And one of the things that's important to remember about what these folks are after is they're after our response. We may be asking, Lauren, Halle, and I may be asking questions, but they're not really questions for the panelists so much as they are for us. And I think their interest is to have, to quote Marcus, who just said, a robust dialogue among us all would be the best benefit from a panel like this. So off you go.
Yeah, thank you so much, Meg. I guess without further ado, we'll introduce our panelists, our esteemed panelists today. First, we have Marcus Sibley, the New York Metro Director of Conservation Partnerships for the National Wildlife Federation and the chair of the New Jersey Progressive Equitable Energy Coalition. We have Nicole Miller, who is the vice chair of the New Jersey Progressive, who is the vice chair of the same organization I just said, the New Jersey Progressive Equitable Energy Coalition, and also a principal for NMM, so sorry, y'all, consulting. And then last but not least, we have Anjuli Ramos, director of the New Jersey chapter of the Sierra Club. And all three of these advocates are working to advance clean energy as part of the Clean Energy Jobs Coalition. And we're so lucky to have them. We really want this, again, to be an open conversation, even with you all, the attendees. So make sure that you're sticking all of your questions in that Q&A box below, and we'll be getting to them throughout this conversation. So Meg, I'm going to pass the mic to you to get this conversation started.
Okay. What we did is trying to prepare for this, we have had Lauren and Aparna and E and Nicole come up with questions that could spark a conversation. So what we're going to do now is ask some of those questions that were asked with all of the other questions. So I'm asking this question, which was posed by Aparna. Oh, we should all say Aparna is also behind the scenes on this. She was going to be part of this, but she got hit with some mother flu that just is awful. So Halle has stepped in heroically to fill the breach. Anyway, Aparna is our new EJ. She's our new executive director. So anyway, this is the question she asks. What are the most ubiquitous forms of climate action misinformation currently circulating, and how do they impact public perception and policy making? That's really a question. It is actually, that one is mostly for the panelists to get us started, because they have developed a sensitivity to this particular area. So if the panelists can offer any ideas about that, that would be wonderful.
Well, thank you all. I'm happy to jump in and get us started. I understand, Halle, it can be hard sort of rattling off titles. I'm Nicole Miller, Principal Consultant of M&M Consulting, also Vice Chair of NJPEEC, and happy to be here with you all. Really, when I personally think of misinformation, there's misinformation and disinformation. So information that is just kind of wrong and misleading to people, and then disinformation that's actively trying to work against the clean energy transition as well as other sustainable goals. And so with regard to misinformation, the most sort of pervasive and general element is that we have lots of time. There are solutions out there that are sort of, in the works. The smartest people in the room are working on them. And we're going to have things under control. It'll be fine, right? Like, it's just sort of like we're sort of all being calmly led off a cliff, in my opinion. But I do want to get the conversation started, so I'll let Marcus and Anjuli sort of jump in.
I can go. Nicole, that was great. Hi, everybody. Anjuli Ramos, New Jersey, Sierra Club Director. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be part of this conversation. To Nicole's point, we have all the time in the world. We just have to take it step by step. But it's also all of the solutions that a lot of really smart people, not just in our country, but across the world, are coming up to deal with climate change and get us out of our fossil fuel dependence. They're too costly. It's too expensive. We cannot do this because, God forbid, this other industry takes a hit. And what are we going to do about this other facility? And everybody's going to go out of business. And, to the point of like, we have to take it step by step. Let's just do this calmly. We have the time. Why the urgency? And it just feels like no one is reading the room. Scientists keep telling us, right? And advocates, we just carry the words of science and the facts, that there is a sense of urgency. Every single report that we get every year, which is, I don't even know how many, 20, 10, tells us and get it. And the problem is that those voices from industry, particularly from fossil fuels, are the ones that get quoted every single time. Marcus, I'll let you go.
No, absolutely. And good afternoon, everyone. Mark Sibley, Director, National Wildlife Federation, New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut, Chair for the New Jersey Progressive Equitable Energy Coalition, and along with Nicole, member of the New Jersey Reparations Council. And I mentioned that one as well because a lot of the conversation we have are about different perspectives and different sense of urgency. Urgency for one group may not be as urgent to another group. And for me, a big part of this conversation is recognizing you need multiple voices. You can't just have the same 2 or 3 people you're going to, because I can tell you in my energy hat, my sense of urgency is a little bit different than my reparations hat. And I have to be very clear about that. And that's why we need to have different people in this room having these conversations, because urgent is urgent, but the powers that be are always going to try to do their best to downplay what urgent looks like. Because as long as you keep the status quo, as long as you keep the certain money going a certain way, you keep certain communities in a certain position. So it's up to us to really try our best to convey the importance of due diligence as a reporter, bringing in different voices, but also valuing data, because the data is what matters. People are going to always use fear. Industry is always going to use different tactics to play on those different fears, use other information to divert us from the reality. But the reality is, both Nicole and Anjuli pointed out, the data is here. It's been here for a long time, and we try our best to convey it, but no one has a better platform or microphone than our reporters. So it's important for us to convey that message to you, because when you start sharing the data that is real, that you can have conversations with us and we can confirm, yes, this is true. We're working directly with universities. We're working with researchers. We're working with experts, working with scientists. This is real. Then you can disseminate that information. So I think we just have to work a little bit harder about being intentional about getting the facts out there.
And
Meg?
I saw Meg, you put your hand up. Just one additional sort of point that Anjuli actually reminded me of, because there's, of course, we have lots of time, the varying kinds of urgency in the different audiences that Marcus mentioned. There's also the point Anjuli mentioned about this is going to be very expensive. There's an element of change that's required. And it's, I think the lack of understanding of the ubiquity of how fossil fuels are embedded in every single aspect of our lives and the consequences of the last 200 years of burning fossil fuels has to require a similar kind of sea change. And the fact that this isn't part of every conversation, especially when it's relevant, is mind-boggling to me. Just today, actually, I read an article about the gardening zones changing for the first time since 2012. Nowhere in the article does it mention that the gardening zones are changing because the climate is warming. Those two things are absolutely linked to each other, but it's just sort of like, hey, gardeners, guess what? Now you have a warmer hardness zone. It's like, are we going to have a conversation about this or are we not? And so it's really the ubiquitous nature of the fact that this is part of everything. As Anjali mentioned, oh, we'll have to reimagine what concrete production looks like. Absolutely. We'll have to reimagine what our neighborhoods look like, what's typical, dropping off children in the morning to school. All of those things are part of a lifestyle that we've developed over the last 60 years that is counteractive to good climate movement. And so we have to have the conversations about that.
Can I jump in now? I would just like to be a little bit irritating to our panelists, and a little bit in defense of the specific journalists you're talking to are among the most sophisticated as far as climate change and how to prove the problem, the reality of climate change. I think it is fair to say that the media by and large doesn't do a great job of that. There is this weird thing, though, that the stories and articles that an SEJ member might produce for any outlet or as a freelancer is often not given the same sort of prominence as some murder and mayhem story. So this sophistication that we have developed over the 20 or 30 years that we've been wrestling with the problem of how to get the information about climate change out to the public we are not a fair representation of media as a whole, to be honest. And the other thing I would like to say is, as someone who has some commitment to hearing the voices of the grassroots, how hard it is to get them to talk to us. We touched on this a little bit yesterday when we were talking about the things we could talk about. And I would say that when some development is likely to provoke an environmental justice issue, or when there is some movement to right the wrongs of the past, it's incredibly important for the work that we do to be able to speak to people who are impacted, because that is the truth of climate change. And absolutely, I think everyone who is listening to this is a sophisticated person and knows why that is difficult. But if I could say there's one thing that I would love to be able to do, is to somehow find it a little easier to access people who have experienced harm and can talk about it.
So just to jump in really quickly, and thank you so much for sharing that. I guess the first thing I would say is we 1000% acknowledge the reality of the difficulty of your job as a journalist. We don't want to ever give the impression that we don't know as someone pointed out, that you're working on multiple stories, you have deadlines, you have editors. There's so many different factors, and I would be not doing my job as an advocate if I didn't recognize the reality of their plight. I think the reason that Anjuli, Nicole, and I are here is because we recognize that, and now we're trying to find ways to make this better moving forward, recognizing the pitfalls and the shortcomings of a very difficult position that it is of being a journalist. So for one thing, when it comes down to the point about having multiple voices, this takes work. This takes planting seeds. We want to have conversations now about what can we do in our different regions where we're having get-togethers periodically through the year, so we're making connections with our leaders in these communities, so that there are no cold calls anymore, so that we are already connected. So when there's a story, you reaching out to 5 or 6 people. I'm one of the people in that chain in New Jersey when there's environmental calls, and I'm very grateful to be on that list. But I want to make sure that people aren't contacting me for that story. Let's have a relationship so that we're speaking throughout the year. So when that story comes around, it's not off-putting and it's like, okay, cool, like we have a relationship. There's steps that we can take. So one is building that relationship. The second thing is within that relationship, having these types of conversations. Let's have conversations throughout the year so that our reporters can continue have an understanding of the landscape, because we have different vantage points. And the reality is the people who need to know up-to-date information are our journalists, and we want to help and be of a value add in that process. So the understanding of the difficulties is definitely understandable. We get it, but we want to be forward thinking, because at the end of the day, one thing that we all can recognize, and all 3 of us are leaders in different spaces throughout the state. We all know how important it is what we're working on once it gets pressed. So what we definitely want to continue to work on is how do we continue to make this important? Like we want the truth to be clickbait. Like we want the truth to be something that people are excited about. And I think that takes brainstorming. I think that takes collaboration. I don't believe that I don't believe that we can't message better about how the climate is impacting people's trajectory. I think there's so many stories where we can connect what is happening to people's loved ones. I think there's ways to do that, and I think we can continue to work hard at that. But I never want to downplay how significant the role is, how difficult the role is. But I think it's ways that we can work together to make this a better process.
I'm really digging the conversation that's happening both in the Q&A. If you haven't checked out the Q&A, please check it out, as well as in the chat. The first question I saw there in the chat provides specific examples, and then are you suggesting journalists not quote fossil fuel industry participants? God forbid, GE and the fossil fuel industry don't get quoted. I don't think that's what any of us are saying. And with regard to specific reporters or specific outlets, we're in New Jersey, and so sort of like the folks that are covering it, NJ Spotlight News, 101.5. There's definitely the seek for balance, and I think Meg had brought this up in a question. The idea that we're seeking balance here in the conversation, it's really not balanced. The balance is not balanced, right? We have people who are supported and funded by the fossil fuel industry who have a vested interest in the status quo and maintaining that, in slowing this process down and not changing over, not having an energy transition, not radically addressing the lifestyles that are driving us over a climate cliff. And then you have people who have, as Anjuli mentioned, the actual data to back up the fact that, okay, what we have is not tenable. And I love there's somebody who put either in the chat or into the Q&A that it's hard for freelancers like SEJ members to be able to get their stories through. And so that's a question I have for the journalists in the room. Like, what's the roadblock there? Like, what's the hump to get over to be able to get those stories that are hard hitting and that are very sort of like blatant? Like, this is what's actually happening. And maybe there's several choices that need to be made, but one of them is not do nothing. And so, you know, I love the tenor of the conversation. I know Halle had her hand up, Anjali's got her hand up. I'll step back.
Well, sorry, Anjali, if I can just step in here real quick. I wonder, Lauren, would you want to respond to Nicole's question about freelancers specifically, if you have any thoughts or experiences that might help with that?
I mean, as a freelancer based in the Adirondack Park, which is very environmentally focused, I'm lucky to be able to write these stories. And I also write for Delaware Currents. So it's easy for me to do that. As a freelancer, I was a daily reporter for 2 years before that, though. That was where I ran into the most roadblocks, was in the newsroom. There's definitely like a generational political divide there. As a younger reporter who's constantly trying to kind of intersect climate issues with how it affects like communities of color and queer communities. Editors and publishers, especially like well-established, can be really resistant to that. At the end of the day, they're the ones making the call. So one of my questions was like, how do we kind of stand firm in that? How do we push back? Because it can be really disheartening, especially when you're trying to churn out 2 stories a day. And you don't really have like a lot of time or power involved.
Meg, did you want to respond? Anjali, do you want to, would it be better for Meg to respond to that and then we can get to you? Okay. Meg, do you want to go?
Yeah, one of the ways, in fact, Jay mentioned it in either the questions or the chats, that one of the biggest ways that you can help journalists is invite them to be part of SEJ, because there is a fellowship there that is informed and knowledgeable. And many of the people who are now SEJ members are people who have been through what you specifically, Lauren, mentioned about the sort of the generational divide. And I believe the generational divide is something that's ubiquitous. I mean, the difference between the sort of under 40 crowd and the over 40 crowd reminds me of way back in the dawn of time when I was young, and there was this thing about not trusting anyone over 30. There is a reason why younger folks might not want to trust older folks, because the older folks, like me, gave us the world we're trying to repair. But there are strategies, there is intelligence, there is even just simple camaraderie at SCJ that helps you continue to fight the good fight. The last thing I want to say is something that I think is really important these days. Every reporter is an environmental reporter, because climate change and sea level rise are happening everywhere. So the expertise that SCJ possesses to help even the person who has to write the 2 stories a day, that person will also have to cover flooding when it hits their local river and when 15, 20 people are displaced. Why has that flooding happened? And sort of linking that to the world that is changing around us is incredibly important. But most local journalists feel that SCJ is like a cut above. It's for the smart people, it's for the data analysts, it's for the scientists. And while it is true that we have those people in our membership, we also have plain Janes and plain Joes who are just doing the job that you have to do every day as a journalist. Hey, kiddo, over to you.
Yeah, Anjali.
Thank you, Meg. That was really inspiring. I truly agree 100% that every reporter is an environmental reporter. And why is that flooding happening? And we have to say it 100 times. It's because of climate change. Even if it's, entirely inland, has nothing to do with the ocean, it is climate change. So the reason why I raised my hand is because I wanted to provide a concrete example of something that Marcus, Nicole, and I all experienced in New Jersey with misinformation around offshore wind. This really, it was really intense. Last year, it all started with a couple of whales washing ashore our beaches, January of 2023. It is not, and it was all over the press, right? And there were some community groups blaming offshore wind exploratory steps like sonar or studying the seafloor as the reason why these whales were washing ashore in an unprecedented, number of whales dying. It is not until March 1st, I remember this day, that an article from Fast Company came out explaining the connection, the direct connection of these community groups to the Cesar Rodney Institute in Delaware and other direct fossil fuel and fossil fuel money connections to these groups. It was very clear. It was right there in the press, an article that finally made that connection, that the people that were actually putting this misinformation out had direct connections to the fossil fuel industry, which there clearly is an interest to try to stop the development of offshore wind for New Jersey, which is one of our biggest tools to combat climate change. But even with that, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is because it's still happening. It's still in the press. It's because reporters, and I'm talking about from local all the way to big media outlets in New Jersey and even in other states in New York, Delaware, Massachusetts, are still talking about whales dying because of offshore wind. Is still being quoted. The people that have been proven to have an interest, into delaying offshore wind are still being quoted. Every single little event that they do at the beach to protest offshore wind gets a reporter at the event, even if there's only 10 people there. However, and I'm just venting here my frustration, however, we work very hard to put out events that show the public support towards clean energy and offshore wind in New Jersey, and that doesn't get covered. And I'm assuming it's because the editors are saying no, to the point of the previous conversation. But it's really frustrating because the science is out there. We have major national organizations and agencies telling everyone there is no connection between offshore wind and the whales dying, yet is still in the press, and it's been over a year. So how can we inform the public best? How can we educate the public best if the misinformation, even though we're all aware it's misinformation, keeps being, it's being in the press and keeps getting quoted? I can talk about this for hours, so I'm just gonna take a step back and let Marcus and Nicole speak. But yes, huge sense of frustration for all of us.
1000%. And thank you for providing a concrete example for everyone too, Anjuli, which is really important. I just wanted to go really quickly to just power. Like, I sometimes I think you guys have been in the profession so long, you forget how significant your power is. The power of the press means a lot. It's like, it didn't happen until it was reported on. So we're always going to value these conversations and these relationships because your involvement matters so much. So when we're speaking about, like someone put in a comment about, does that mean we shouldn't interview fossil fuel? Yes, we should 100%. Like, we are never saying do one side of anything. We're saying you have the power to get the truth out. So let's have balance in all of our reporting. Make sure there's balance, and then we can have these conversations to make sure that it is true balance, because sometimes one, as Anjuli is pointing out, one who is saying they're of a community, when you do your digging, they've been co-opted a long time ago. They're receiving funds from the same machine. So you may think you have a balance, but you really don't. Another really thing I wanted to point out was, we recognize that editors and the different newsrooms is always going to have an impact on stories and on progress. That's another place where I think having these conversations with advocates matter, because we're part of organizations. We 100% can mount campaigns pushing for more balanced reporting and pushing editors to get things out. Like, you don't have to be your own advocate on that thing, because that is something we absolutely see. And definitely from our organization, we see the importance of the press and when there is imbalance, and we absolutely can mount a campaign making sure that these editors are not only leaning towards clickbait, because that's just not fair. As we pointed out, we have a lot of people here who are writing stories because they care, because they matter. And sometimes those stories don't make it because editors have different agendas. We can help with that. community activists can help pushing the envelope, making sure these editors see that this is important. And the last thing I was going to say is, Meg, you pointed out that, you know, this audience here are people who are care about these issues. That goes without being said. But I see this as continuing education, just like for any profession. There needs to be continuing education. We need to continuously learn new things, enhance our equity lens in this work. That's why connecting with different community leaders makes a lot of sense, because we can always get a little bit better at what we're doing. So we love what you're doing, but we can always get better. We can always improve. We can always improve our skill set in this space. Nicole?
Yes. Again, wish we had 2 hours, okay? Because I'm digging it. In the chat, I think there's been a few questions about, there's been some recurring questions about the inclusion of fossil fuel voices. And I don't think anybody is saying they should not, I mean, I don't think that they won't ever be quoted or included. I don't think it's not fair or not okay to include them. Absolutely include them, and also point out that they have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Their jobs, their livelihood is connected to making sure that fossil fuels continue to flow through pipelines and continue to be burned. And I also think that there's a bit of a distinction between your environmental reporters your climate reporters who have been empowered to speak on this, to speak boldly on it, to make plain those connections, very much different than your beat reporters, than your reporters who cover other things, business reporters, health reporters, all of those sort of folks who cover those different beats. Climate change is affecting every single one of those aspects and should be included as a portion of it. And so it is a little bit of, you know, if we're talking to people who are specifically environment reporters who focus on the environment and change is happening, yeah, absolutely. A lot of times that crowd is very much empowered and allowed. Their editors have no problem with it. But I can tell you that, what's the name of that industry? I can't remember. It starts with a P. That has reporting specifically for business in New Jersey. It's like escaping me for some reason, but they like will focus on the business aspects and have environmental advocates pitted against business advocates who are saying, oh, to Anjali's point, oh, this is moving too fast. We're trying to disrupt the system. It's upsetting, you know, it's going to cost you an arm and a leg, and not have the other side of the data that the advocates, the environmental and environmental justice advocates do have that say, actually, this is going to cost, if we look at the numbers of what energy, electricity costs versus what gas costs now, especially in light of world events, this is going to be more economical. This is going to be better efficiency for the home. This is going to improve health outcomes, both internal and external, air quality for the home. So those are the kinds of incorporations that we really want to have in these conversations. One great example that comes to mind is, and I've been harping on it, I know Marcus and Anjuli are tired of me talking about it, the highway expansion conversation that's happening here in New Jersey right now. Lots of conversation about $10 billion being spent to replace 16 bridges. Those bridges are unsafe and they're 70 years old. They need to come down. All for it. I'm all for safety. Does that mean that we need to be expanding the system to improve congestion, to improve air quality, which we know from 40 years of highway expansions is not how it works? Induced demand will mean that there will be more traffic. There will be more air, there will be poor air quality as a result of this. And so in those articles that are talking about, oh, the economic benefits that this transportation will bring and the jobs that will bring, are not also talking about the negative health outcomes for the communities where this work is going to be happening, and the continued reliance on the fossil fuel industry that's being paid for by taxpayers and by the people who pay tolls on these roads to perpetuate the fossil fuel industry and our car culture, et cetera. All those conversations, those should be built in as well. And so it's really, again, that ubiquity conversation that is missing in many conversations.
Yeah, and I just wanted to chime in here and say again, thank you. So thank you to you guys for addressing a lot of the questions in the chat have been about trying to find specific examples of misinformation that the press has had. There's also some agreement here. Clint Wilder in the Q&A says that there's a big growth of disinformation at the local level. He says sowing opposition to a wind farm, for example, like the idea that wind farms cause cancer and the like. And so he was kind of wondering, I think that Nicole, you were getting to this, like some tips for local reporters and just journalists in general to avoid this like both sidesism that I think we're all pretty concerned with, environmental journalists as well. And maybe even exposing, as Clint says, the fossil fuel industry backed citizen groups that are often behind it.
I mean, just in response to that, it's different. You know, if I'm the CEO of OPEC, I don't know, does OPEC have a CEO? I don't know. You know, I'm a rep for OPEC. Then obviously, I'm very clearly representing the oil producers, right? But it's much more insidious when there's a climate scientist that is reporting and says, you know what, you know, this is being blown out of control, out of proportion. We should slow down. And that person's connection to the fossil fuel industry is not also included. Actually, this scientist has been funded by, you know, whatever the case may be. Those are the kinds of connections. But to your point about connecting with local groups, it's really a matter of making the connections. I think Marcus talked about sort of having regular sort of roundtables, developing, you know, in whatever particular area. Halle, I know you mentioned that you're in New Orleans. There's lots of people who are on the ground. They're doing incredible work across water, energy, infrastructure, et cetera. And it's really the voices that are on the ground who have many of the solutions, and they know the ways in which they are being either overrun or overspoken, or their issues are not being addressed.
Yeah, and I was just gonna add, I think another important part of this is like knowing your landscape. Like on this call, we've used the term climate change over and over again. Some people are in communities where they can't use the term climate change because people are going to shut their brains off. I think that's something we need to have a very serious conversation about when we're talking about how we grab people's attention and how do we get down to the truth. I think we can definitely convey all the impacts of climate change without using the term climate change in the regions where that isn't beneficial. And I think that's an important conversation to have, because I see a lot of people are set on, and again, this is my opinion. I don't say I'm speaking for Anjuli and Nicole, but I'm saying from my experiences, a lot of people are dead set on using terms that they're comfortable with, and they don't pay attention to the demographics where their paper serves or their publication serves, and they miss out, and they're disconnected from people. And I'm saying I try to avoid trigger words. I try to avoid buzzwords. I try to learn. This is where those community conversations come in. I try to learn what works best for the community that I'm working in, and then speak to that. So if I need to name all the implications of what's happening to our climate without saying climate change to get someone to pay attention, I'm going to do that. And I don't see that enough. And I think that's a part of the divide, because there are people who will acknowledge what's happening, but as soon as they hear the word climate change, oh no, buddy, I don't know about that. Or I can speak to all the different impacts of racism, but you mention environmental racism. Oh, buddy, I don't know about that. So I'm saying I don't really want to waste time with people. I want to give people what they can digest. So I think I'm going to continue to harp on this, whether it's working with a PR firm, whether it's working with different trusted messengers, that relationship between community leaders and our journalists is very, very important. And I think regardless, whether you're in the Adirondacks, whether you're in New Orleans, there's always community people who are fighting. There's always journalists who want to share good stories, but we're still disconnected. And I think that being intentional about creating avenues where there's real conversation is important. And I think SCJ has a great platform to kind of usher in that era in different regions of bringing these different community members. I can guarantee you that the community member will show up. You put it in the evening time around 6 o'clock, community members will show up because they want these right stories to get out. We're tired of the misinformation and disinformation campaigns running the headlines. We're sick of it. We're sick of the minority of the community getting the majority of the headlines. We're tired of that. So we want to continue. And again, please use this as a resource. And I'm just quick plug. Make sure you add us on LinkedIn. I'm going to put our Facebook and then our social media handles down. We want to have relationships. We want to be of assistance. We want to make sure everyone is doing their job a lot better.
I also do want to make a plug for, to Marcus's point, people do tend to turn off when they hear it's ridiculous. I don't know. We all live here and breathe the air, but for some reason, it's been so politicized, unfortunately, that a lot of times, the rooms that we're in, Marcus, Anjuli, and I, we're focused on health outcomes. We're focused on jobs and economics because those are things that people are still willing to have conversations about. They're willing to be to listen on. If we talk to people about, sealing up your homes for energy efficiency, that means that it's going to be warmer inside your home when it's cold outside, and it's going to be cooler inside your home when it's warm outside. Those things people are still willing to have conversations on. Where there's money and funding around that. There's ways in which we can talk across aisles about those kinds of improvements, making sure that there are jobs that are happening here in New Jersey, balanced with affordable energy that we can get from out of state. Those are the kinds of conversations we can have that don't necessarily mention a clean energy transition. I talked, recently we had a rally, and I talked about energy independence, right? Our renewable energy is energy independence. And so you don't have to give two hoots about the horseshoe tail crab, the horseshoe crab, poor horseshoe crab. You don't have to give two hoots about any sort of other species in the environment or, Black and brown people in frontline communities to want energy independence. And that's something that we can have conversations with people about. And so it's really a matter of meeting people where they are, of course, and focusing. If we focus on health outcomes alone, we could get a lot done.
Halle, you want to go first?
Anjuli, were you going to comment on something related to what they were talking about? Because I was going to bring in another question.
I'm just going to add something entirely.
Okay.
I mean, it's of course connected, but it's new. It's something that we struggle with overall, if that's okay.
Yeah, feel free. I'll come in after.
Okay, great. So I just wanted, and I don't know, that this entire conversation has inspired my next sort of argument, and something that the three of us struggle a lot is that we're environmental advocates, EJ advocates, and everything that we're pushing forward is based on science. It's based on reports. It's based on cost benefit analysis. Conducted by agencies, conducted by, reputable organizations and government institutions. That's always what we're trying to carry to the public. And we struggle because of the clickbait situation. When you have a business group, right? I'm not just going to say fossil fuel industry, but just a business organization that represents, or a coalition that represents a multitude of businesses in the state of New Jersey, and say, well, this is going to cost us millions of dollars. And that's what you're going to keep seeing in every single article. This is going to cost us 10 millions, 20 millions, millions of dollars. This is unavoidable. And then here we are on our side. Well, here's a report that says it's actually not going to cost you that $10 million. It's actually going to save you this amount of money. To Nicole's point earlier in the conversation about energy efficiency, right? And electrification of our homes and buildings. And so we struggle a lot with the fact that we want to educate the public about the science and the data and the reports that are coming out. But reporters, and this is my experience, of course, I'm not saying that everybody is the same, they don't want to talk about the report. They don't want to link the report in the article because it's too technical, because it's too scientific, or I really just don't understand. But it is very difficult for us to battle inflated arguments or stances that just say, well, this is going to cost $10 million, and we have no way no way to defend those points because our evidence is too boring to be quoted. And so as a scientist myself, and my background is science, I'm like, but it's not boring. This is the information. This is what you need to read in order to really understand what's going on. So this is, to me, like, this is an overall question to everybody, whoever wishes to, respond, put it in the chat. Like, what do we need to do to make science and data sexy for everybody to just say, well, I'm not going to pay attention to the crazy guy that's saying that this is just going to cost $10 million without any evidence or foundation. I'm going to go to the facts and the data. Anyways, our struggles.
Meg, please go. I was also just going to mention that there has been some pushback in the chat, and especially in terms of editors. One person said that they felt it was a bit insulting just because they have so many events and not enough reporters to send to those things. We're also getting some pushback from folks saying that they've never had their editor tell them not to write a story. So Meg, maybe you can also weigh in on that while you're responding to Anjuli.
So congratulations to them.
I think everyone's experience is different. And I think the smaller the newsroom, the more desperate the effort to cover the news. The newsroom that I was once one of the leaders for had 150 people in that newsroom. This is now 15 years ago. It now has 5. How in heaven's name is anyone going to cover the area that was once covered by 150 journalists with 5 journalists? And that also means that the people in charge who have the title of editor have very little experience, because one of the things that this whole legacy newspaper takeover by icky groups, but anyway, has reduced the salaries of everyone. So you don't have necessarily an experienced editor, even helming a group of 5 people. You have someone who is barely out of college helming a group of 5 people to cover an enormous amount of news. So that's one thing. But I also think the issue that you were talking about, Anjuli, we have entered a world, I think we've been in this world for quite a long while, at least 10 years or so, where fear is the attractive drug, right? We are more drawn than I think ever before to stories that make us afraid. And stories that debunk that fear. It's sort of like if I wake up in the middle of the night and I hear footsteps on the stairs, well, the only way I'm going to be sure that there's not footsteps on the stairs is if I turn on the light with my baseball bat and go to the top of the stairs and check, right? But fear just driving people to an extreme degree, and the fear stories capture people's imaginations, and the debunking stories never get there. They don't hear it, or they hear the story from their great Aunt Gwendolyn who saw it from a neighbor. And that sort of stuff has a validity that the news media generally doesn't have. Even legacy newsrooms, even the sort of reputable places. One of the things that Parna mentioned, and which I think might be an interesting topic of conversation, is it's not just the news stories, it's social media. How do we combat social media? Because that is such a carrier of the nonsense. And I have absolutely no idea. If you have any suggestions, I'd be interested in hearing them.
It's such a great and terrible point that you bring up, Meg, because we didn't even touch on that, right? Like the ubiquity of Facebook, WhatsApp,
X,
Twitter, whatever he's calling it. All of that, because that doesn't have to come from an official source, right? That just has to be salacious enough to capture people's attention. And it can also be distracting. But I think that when we, there's been, again, great conversation happening in the Q&A and in the chat, talking about the reading level of people and sort of comprehension. I think most articles should be sort of written at a place where people can understand. I'm a big believer in analogies. Marcus, Anjuli, and Meg probably at this point know I'm a big believer in analogies. And so they work well, I think, to bring people to a place where they can get understanding about complex things. But to your point, that I think is outside the responsibility of journalists. It's the responsibility of journalists to continue to hold the line with regard to the truth, not to chase after every sort of ill-informed social media post that's out there. We should be holding, in my opinion, we should be holding the platforms more responsible for the voice that they give, just as we hold media platforms responsible for the things that they say. Similarly, and that is a tricky conversation. Those conversations are being had right now in both the legal sphere as well as in the public place. What's the responsibility of platforms with regard to policing messaging? We do want to make sure that people are allowed to have their points and have their thoughts, whether I agree with them or not. I think someone in the chat mentioned that, you know, misinformation might just be something that people don't want to hear. and it's that might be a person's perspective, especially if they're looking at a $10 billion highway expansion as a great thing, because, oh, the restaurant that they have that's at the end of that line is going to get even more people coming to it now. They're all for it, right? And so they're only going to see that the positives of this. And part of the issue is that maybe we as advocates really on the ground dealing with 1 in 4 children here in the city of Newark, where I live, that have asthma, and understanding the particulate matters, the air pollution, the cumulative impacts that water, air, soil toxicity have. We're a little too keyed in on the negative effects that it's hard to even see those positive aspects, especially when they are relatively short term. And so what we're, I think, asking, pleading, in fact, is that the true stark reality of where we find ourselves is much more plainly stated, and that there do have to be hard decisions. There will be costs associated with it, but those costs should be balanced with what we have to gain.
Yeah, and really quickly, I just wanted to say we don't want to leave this webinar without conveying the reality of the situation. We recognize that people aren't buying newspapers anymore. It's digital. The revenues from newspapers has now impacted the size of newsrooms where people are getting let go. We recognize that editors or what have you are going with some of the more salacious top clickbait because you have to keep the lights on. I don't ever want to pretend like I don't understand the reality of keeping the lights on and the difficulties that everybody in here has to navigate. I don't want to pretend like that's not a reality. The only thing I'm saying is understand what the reality is and figure out how you can still do the work as well. So we recognize the realities and the difficulties involved in your jobs, but how can we still make sure the truth is getting out? How can we develop relationship with these community leaders? How can we have brainstorming sessions to make sure that we can have sexier bylines and sexier stories? Because I like Anjuli a lot, but sometimes data is definitely boring. I'm not a scientist. It doesn't hit home for me all the time. So I need a little more for me to get engaged. And how can we put our minds together, put our thinking caps on to do a better job of conveying the truth? Because the truth has power. Our listeners and our readers are more intelligent than a lot of time we give them credit for. We need to give them the truth and let them decipher how they want to move forward. But we have to get the truth out. We have to be honest about the misinformation and disinformation. We just have to do a better job of giving people, because information is tools. That's the last thing I want to say. Everything we share are tools that people will use to dictate how they're going to live their lives and how they're going to put themselves in better position so they can have healthier lives. These are very important and valuable tools that we have to get out to the community. So we have to continue to work harder at doing the best we can in this space. And I'll pass it over to Halle. Thank you all so much once again.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Marcus, because I mean, I do like data and science stories. I think a lot of us here do, but we're also really trying to ground those in like lived human experiences, right? And I think that's something Meg, Lauren, Aparna, hope that she feels better, all of you guys have been talking about together. I just wanted to make sure, since we're coming to the end, Meg, Lauren, do either of you have any final wrap-up questions that you wanted to ask? Meg, you're muted. You were so close. Meg, you're muted.
Epic fail. I was just going to say that it's the questions in the Q&A that are fabulous. I don't know, is there a way that, do they become available for people after this? I mean, is there a way that we could make them available to our 3 panelists, for example? Because I think that these are the sorts of questions that, you know, if we just had 24 hours to do this webinar, we might get to them all. But that would give them insights into what the journalists who have been listening, how they are responding. And that could be really valuable for them. I don't know what our usual technique is for that, but I would heartily recommend that especially the Q&A section be delivered to the panelists and to me, because it'll widen my frame of reference, which is, I think, as journalists, we're always trying to do.
If there's a way to distribute that to members, I think that would be important, because these are questions that even if we can't get all the answers today, these are things a lot of people are thinking about. And I would love for your membership to mull over what their insights and thoughts of. And taking a step further, I would love for that to be added to your website at some point, because these are important things that won't change. These concepts will not go away. So I think it could be a really helpful tool moving forward.
Both the chat and the Q&A, a lot going on there. And it's, you know, very clear that there's some people who are sort of very, you know, they have their position and they have their opinions, and that's perfectly fine. We, you know, we're not here to shut down opinions. It's really a matter of making sure that the conversations going forward are moving us in a direction where we can be working towards positive solutions. That's what I think Marcus, Anjuli, and I are here focused on. That's what we want. We don't want anything that's too reductive. Understandably, early in the Q&A, somebody said that the reporter's job isn't to promote any particular agenda. And we think that's true. I think if people had the real basic true circumstances and the true solutions and the true frustrations and harms that people with perfectly common sense could come to, you know, for the majority of, I think, thinking people, you know, a shared solution. But unfortunately, we're getting a jumble mix of input.
Yeah, we can definitely hope. I did want to say, I wonder if staff maybe we could try to save the chat and maybe distribute that somehow over email afterwards. But we are at time, so I did want to try to wrap things up, unless Lauren, Meg, you had any final thoughts.
I do. Sorry, the last thing I would say is that we have this tremendous mis and disinformation workshop that's happening with the folks from the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania. They just are absolutely talking our language about that tremendous threat to our democracy as we face this election. So that's really cool. But there's threads of this throughout the conference. So whatever your point of view is as a journalist, it can be represented and valued when we're in conversation with each other. And what did you say? The conference, you can register for the conference until Monday
at midnight Eastern time.
There you go.
So please do. I mean, we can continue this great conversation there. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone, to Meg, to Lauren, to Marcus, Anjuli, Nicole. Really robust conversation today. Really appreciate it. And thanks to all of the attendees for being so active in this conversation and dialogue as well. And yeah, again, just another plug. Don't forget to register. And also we'll be continuing this conversation even beyond the conference throughout this year. So
absolutely.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much. Thank you
all. Thank you, everybody.
Wonderful conference. Have a wonderful upcoming conference.
Yes.